This is the California Liberty Project podcast.
Welcome back to the California Liberty Project podcast. I am very glad you have joined us today on our podcast episode. I've got a great guest. I'm very excited to speak with Dr. Walter Block. Someone who you probably all know or have heard of, or maybe you're familiar with his work, some very well-known books. Let me quickly just mention that Dr. Block, Walter, is the Harold E. Wirth Eminent Scholar and Endowed Chair and Professor of Economics at Loyola University of New Orleans. And he has been a professor at several different academic institutions through his career. He is an Austrian school economist and a prominent anarcho-capitalist theorist. I think it's very fair to say. He is the author of a few dozen books, very namely and very well known, Defending the Undefendable, which is very interesting and garnered a lot of attention through the years. And he is also, interestingly enough, from what I understand, an old high school chum and classmate of Bernie Sanders, one of our, well, I won't say favorites, but the infamous Bernie Sanders. Walter, welcome to the show, and thank you very much for coming on to the California Liberty Project podcast.
Greg, thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Really appreciate your time. So first, I wanted to ask, if I may, if you will indulge me, growing up in Brooklyn, New York, you met and came into contact with a lot of different, very interesting people. From what I've heard, your accounts of your early years, growing up in a largely probably left-wing milieu, possibly almost communist. I don't know if that's fair to say, but far left. And in addition to going to high school or being on the track team or something with Bernie Sanders, you also came into contact at a relatively early age, from what I understand, with Ayn Rand, and perhaps saw a lecture of hers at either Brooklyn College or some institution in New York, and then later became perhaps a student or pupil or someone who was mentored by the great Murray Rothbard. What was it like coming up in those circles in New York City, Brooklyn at that time, and, well, meeting Ayn Rand, for example, maybe your first foray into the liberty world?
Right. Well, I was at Brooklyn College, and Ayn Rand came to speak, and I came to boo and hiss her because she favored free enterprise, and everyone knows that free enterprise is fascism, and babies will be starving in the streets, and it'll just be awful. So we can't have capitalism. It's just evil and inefficient and very bad. And at the end of the lecture, they announced that anyone could come to the lunch in her honor, even if you disagreed. And I disagreed. I wanted to convert her to socialism. So I went there, and there was this long table. She was sitting at the head of it with her buddies, Nathaniel Brandon, Alan Greenspan, and the other chief Randians. Mm-hmm. And I was relegated to the other end of the table. There were no seats there. And I turned to my neighbor and I said, capitalism is evil, socialism is great. And he said, well, I don't really know all that much about it, but the people who do are at the other end of the table.
Right.
So I stuck my head in between Ayn's and Nathan's, and I said, there's a socialist who wants to debate someone. I was maybe 20 years old, maybe a sophomore in college. Brandon maybe 35, Rand 50, give or take. And Brandon was very, very generous, very, very nice. And he said, look, there's no room at this end of the table, but I'll come to the other end of the table and talk to you. But you have to make two promises. One, you don't allow this conversation to lapse until we settle it. And two, you'll read two books that I'll recommend.
Fair.
Well, I talked to him for a half hour, an hour, and I read the two books, Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand and Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt. And I went to Brandon's house and Rand's house in Manhattan 4 or 5 times, and I was converted. I was then a limited government libertarian. Hazlitt type, Ayn Rand type, whatever. Yeah. Yes, we have to have a government, but it's very, very limited. Armies, courts, police, that's about it.
Sure.
But then I had a sort of a schizophrenic experience with them, approach avoidance, because they were very cultish. If you ask her a nice question, like on page 42 of your book, you said this, could you explain or expand on that? That would be a nice question, and she would answer it. But if you said, I see a contradiction between what you said on page 42 and 150,
Uh-oh.
she would say, get out. She would kick you out. Now, this is very different than the way they treated me when I was being converted. They were very nice to me. They would never do that. I had asked all sorts of stupid questions, and they would give me the Hazlitt type answer, and that was it. But this was really awful.
Yeah.
But I knew no other libertarians or no other free enterprises. Everyone in Brooklyn, where I was from, was practically a commie. So I would stay away for 3 or 4 months, and then I'd come back, and then I'd leave in disgust at the cultism. And now I'm in Columbia University getting my PhD, and my friend then, Larry Moss, said, you got to meet this guy, Murray Rothbard. He's an anarchist. And
Cool.
I said, oh, anarchists? I don't want to meet any anarchists. They're, crazy. We need government. I was sort of, Randish, not cultish, but Randish.
Sure.
And then his roommate, Jerry Wallows, ganged up with Larry against me, and they frog marched me into seeing Murray. And I met Murray, and he converted me into free enterprise, that is anarchism, anarcho-capitalism, in about 10 minutes. He used Hazlitt against me, against my statist views. Hazlitt would say, well, look, we don't really need the government to run the post office. So we could do it privately, and here's why. And it would be more ethical, and it would be more efficient. And Murray just applied that. Well, why not apply that to police or armies or courts? And
Yes.
the light bulb lit on top of my head. And I was then an anarcho-capitalist. And Murray was my mentor, my guru, my friend. And I sort of date my present views to meeting Murray.
Excellent. Now, that's a really cool story. Very good. Now, Murray was not your formal thesis advisor through grad school, was he? He was more of an informal mentor and friend?
Yeah, my thesis advisor was Gary Becker, and then Bill Landis.
Yep.
Murray was a professor at Brooklyn Polytech, not at Columbia. We both got our PhDs from Columbia, but Murray was never a professor at Columbia. Okay.
Got you. One more question on that while we're kind of touching upon academia, and this is an adjacent question. For young people, particularly undergrads looking to dive into the milieu of higher education, speaking of socialism and far leftism, do you have any recommendations for young people where they might go as far as academic departments, economics, business, maybe political science, where they could apply that has a relatively free market department, and then certainly if they choose to continue on to grad school in economics? Any recommendations there?
Well, for grad school, there are only 2 grad schools that have Austrian Austro-libertarianism, and that's Texas Tech and George Mason University. There are several places in Europe.
Sure.
Guido Holtzman, Jesus Huerta de Soto,
Yes.
Matt Mackay in Europe would be good places. For undergraduate, Grove City College would be good, plus these other 2, Texas Tech and George Mason. And my own school, Loyola University, we have 3 professors who are all anarcho-capitalist Austrians. And if you want to study with me and my colleagues, I would recommend Loyola University New Orleans.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that recommendation. I appreciate that. So speaking about anarcho-capitalism, probably a lot of our friends and many of your colleagues in the liberty movement, broadly speaking, but specifically ANCAPs, anarcho-capitalists, with respect to this latest, atrocity by Hamas in Israel, I saw your recent article, of course, the op-ed piece that you co-published, I believe, with Alan Fuderman. And I was very interested because, one, it was a clear moral stance against Hamas's atrocities, which I appreciated because there are so many on the left right now and so many libertarians, certainly so many ANCAPs, who are coming out in a very veiled fashion and trying to be nuanced. I don't know if it's trying to kind of be edgy. I'm not sure. I won't ascribe any ill motives to them. But there seems to be a softness toward Hamas or this atrocity because of perhaps some resistance to the government of Israel's policies, to government policies. However, on a very personal level, if we look at morality, what was done to those innocent people in southern Israel, I completely agree with you as far as those atrocities. They need to be called out. Hamas needs to be held responsible. And I commend you. You came out and took a strong moral stance when a lot of other ANCAPs and libertarians have been kind of flirting around with the Free Palestine movement, and it seems to be kind of in vogue to take more of that stance. Could you elaborate more on, if you'd like to, color in your thesis more and how you came to your view, perhaps with the defense of natural rights, property rights of those innocent people in Israel, and then maybe in the next question we could address some of the objections that ANCAPs and other libertarians might have on the Palestinian side. So I'll hand it over to you to elaborate, because it was a fascinating piece in the Wall Street Journal. Everyone listening should read it.
Thank you. I agree with your characterization of what Hamas did, atrocity, very accurate, despicable, disgusting, whatever, words sort of fail you in terms of what they did to innocent people. It was just disgusting. Well, the way I look at it, and I'm a John Lockean, Murray Rothbardian, how do we determine property rights? Well, the way we determine proper property rights, legitimate titles to property, is through homesteading. I mix my labor with the land, I clear some rocks, I clear some trees, I put in a corn plant or two, and after a year or so or whatever, I own that land. And you domesticate a cow, and you own the milk and I own the corn, and now we trade, and I own the milk even though I didn't produce the milk, and you own the corn even though you didn't produce the corn. But we can trace it back to voluntary interaction, namely barter in this case, and then homesteading, originally homesteading. So to me, the issue between the Palestinians or the Arabs and the Jews is one of property rights. Who really owns those territories? Who is the colonist? Who is the imperialist? Who is the thief of land, land thief? I ask, well, when did Judaism start? Judaism started roughly 3,300 years ago, give or take. The historical record is not exactly clear. I can't say to the exact month or week or anything, but roughly 3,300 years ago. When did Islam and Muslimism start? In the 7th century.
Yeah.
600, 7th century, somewhere in there, and it's maybe 1,600 years old. Christianity is halfway between the two of us. The Jews are the oldest, 3,300. Christians, 2,300. Muslims, Islamists, call it, 1,600 years. So who homesteaded first? Well, the Jews. The first temple, the second temple, the third temple was way before Muhammad was born. So if there's any issue as to who is right and who is wrong, it's the Jews are correct. The Jews are the rightful owners of the property. The Jews trace their ownership of the property back to Roman times, which was before Muhammad was born. So if there's any, that's the libertarian analysis. The libertarian analysis should be who's the rightful owner of the property, and the rightful owner of the property is he who homesteaded it first. Well, the Jews were around twice as long as the Muslims, and they weren't just twiddling their thumbs. They were mixing their labor with land, and they were the rightful owners. They got kicked out. There was the diaspora. They went from country to country, but they were there way before the Muslims. The Muslims came afterward. So if there's any issue as to who owns it, it should be resolved in favor of the Jews. That's one way to look at it. That's the libertarian way to look at it. Another way to look at it is, why do the Palestinians hate the Jews so much? Is it only because of stolen property? Not really, because you had pogroms in 1929 in Hebron, where Jews were slaughtered in an early atrocity, to use your word. And at that time, there was no Israeli government. There was no settlers. There was no dispute over property. It was just hatred of Jews. They are, I tip my hat to them. They are good haters. They are excellent haters. And they hate Jews. I'm not sure exactly why, but they do. So that would be a different explanation as to why the atrocity occurred. But I think from a libertarian point of view, it is based on homesteaded property, and the Jews are in the right on that issue. Now, the next question you ask, well, why don't all libertarians support this? And why are there many libertarians who are either equidistant or on the one hand this and on the other hand that, or on the Palestinian side? And I think it traces to an article that Murray Rothbard wrote. I forget the exact title. It's something like Peace in the Middle East or something like that, where he took the Palestinian side on the basis of property rights. So you ask, well, how can this be if the Jews were there first? And my main critique of Murray, and in our book with my co-author Alan Fuderman, we devote a whole chapter to attempting to refute this. Now, look, I revere Murray Rothbard. I think the world of Murray. Murray is Mr. Libertarian. Murray is magnificent. He's the best economist and the best libertarian theorist, but I don't agree with him on every last issue, and I certainly don't agree with him on this one. And my main divergence from his views is he sort of goes back to 1905 or 1895, when, yes, there were many, many Arabs there and not that many Jews. And he was saying, well, property titles started then.
Yeah.
Well, I said, no.
Zionism, when that began to come into effect.
Zionism, right.
Yeah.
He's saying that the Zionists are wrong because it wasn't an empty place, although there was a lot of swamp and desert there, and the Jews own the arable land, and the Arabs own swamps, which they never homesteaded. But the point is that there were many more of them there. And the reason that there were many more of them there is because the Jews were there first. The Jews had a better economy than in Lebanon or Syria or Iraq or elsewhere, Jordan. And the Arabs floated in order to get better jobs. So they were there. Yes, they were there. And if you start your analysis in 1895 or 1907, well, then I can see Murray's point. He's got a very good point. But I think we have to go back a little further, 2,000 years. Now, you might say, well, what about a statute of limitations? You can't go back 2,000 years. You go back to 1895, at least there are records. But the way I understand proper libertarianism is there is no artificial statute of limitations. You can't say, well, it's 150 years and that's it. Because suppose you go back 151 years and you can prove that you were the rightful owner. Look, I have a wristwatch, and it's got a picture of your grandfather on it. And what happened is my grandfather stole it from your grandfather and gave it to my father, who gave it to me. Well, if you can prove that it's your grandfather, I don't care if it's 2,000 years ago, you're the rightful owner of it, and I should give it to you. Now, there is a natural statute of limitations, namely the further back in history you go, the harder it is to prove anything. Your grandfather's picture might have atrophied in 2,000 years, and you can't prove it, and then it's tough luck on you. So I agree that there is that sort of a statute of limitations, but not any arbitrary one. And half of our book is trying to establish that the Jews owned the land 2,000 years ago. It was a Herculean task, and I think we demonstrated it. So to summarize, I think the proper libertarian view is that the Jews own the contested areas. Why do the many libertarians following Murray don't agree? Well, they start too late in history. They don't go back far enough.
Okay. Can I ask you a few good faith questions? Because I really am interested in your responses. I think a lot of good faith ANCAPs and libertarians would say that if we look at things not as groups of people, but as we look at individual settlers or individual either Arabs or Jewish people who are living there, in the 1890s or the 1948 or what have you. They would say, let's look at it with individual farms, individual homesteads, individual settlements, perhaps. And in I believe 47, 48, there was what the Palestinians call, or what the Arabs call, I believe, the Nakba, or the catastrophe, where I think the facts are correct that 7 to 750,000 Palestinian Arabs were moved out by force or by coercion or what have you. And I'm trying to be totally fair here. And I think that act perhaps rankles a lot of property rights libertarians and ANCAPs, because they say that there was a government, maybe the UN or the new Israeli government, that moved many of these people out, and they were forcibly removed from their land. How would you respond to that charge, Walter?
Well, I think those are very good questions, and I'm delighted to answer them, because if we're not going to get into the nitty-gritty, we're not going to be able to answer these questions.
Sure.
I think you really have two questions. One is this individualism versus group business, and I admit that we can't prove that it was Joe Blow's family 2,000 years ago. It was rather Jews. Well, look, let's get back to this wristwatch that my grandfather stole from your grandfather. I'm assuming that your grandfather would have given it to you. Your grandfather would have given it to your father. And I'm also assuming that your father would have given it to you. And actually what happened is my grandfather gave it to my father, who gave it to me. Well, where do I get that assumption? Well, you have to make some sort of assumption if you're going to go back in history as to what would have happened. And the assumption we're making is that the Jews would have given it to other Jews. They would have given it to their families. But 2,000 years ago is way too far back in the past to say, well, it was Jaime Rabinowitz's father. All we can establish is that there was Jews. Well, I think that that's not unreasonable.
Sure.
Just as it's not unreasonable that I should have to give you this wristwatch back because I'm assuming that your grandfather would have given it to your father. I have it's not praxeology. It's not necessarily true. Your grandfather might have hated your father, his son, and given the watch to my father. Who knows? But you have to have some sort of assumption here. And I think that it's not an unreasonable assumption to say that the Jews would have given it to other Jews, and the Christians would have given it to other Christians, and the Muslims would have given it to other Muslims. Okay, the second point you make is the Nakba, the catastrophe. Well, look, what happened in 1948 when Israel was declared a state, there were 5 countries that went in there and attacked. But before they attacked, what they did is they sent a message to all the Palestinians and the Arabs living in the Jewish area, and they said, get out. Because if you get out, then we can slaughter everyone. Whereas if you're there, it's going to be rougher on us. It's going to be tougher for us to figure out who the good guys and the bad guys are from our point of view, namely the Jews are the bad guys and the Arabs are the good guys. So Arabs, get out. We'll have a quick war, and in about a week we'll wipe out all the Jews, and then you come back and everything will be hunky-dory. And the Jews improperly were saying, hey, don't leave these vineyards and these farms. Stay with us, improperly, because the Jews really own that stuff in the first place, based on 2,000 years ago. And the Arabs, their land titles weren't as kosher as they should have been. But the point of view is, a lot of people say, well, they just went on vacation. Well, not exactly. They didn't exactly go on vacation. Take another example. I'm the getaway driver for a bank robber, and the bank robber kills some people in the bank, and now they come out and I drive them away. Am I guilty? Well, I didn't do anything. I didn't violate the non-aggression principle. All I did is drive. Well, I was aiding and abetting the gang. I was a part of the gang. I drove him to the bank, and I waited there, even though it was a danger to me. The police could have come, and then I drove him away to safety. Yes, I didn't pull any triggers, but I am not totally innocent either. Well, the people who fled in 48 were not totally innocent either, more akin to a bank robber. Namely, they were aiding and abetting the 5 countries' armies who were going to slaughter all the Jews. Now, I'm not saying this is a perfect case. There might have been 1% of the people who were on vacation or just had to go visit Egypt or whatever. But an awful lot of them were not so innocent. They were cooperating. They were aiding and abetting Israel's enemies. Now, look, at the time that the Palestinians lost their property to the Jews and want to get it back, there were many, many Jews in Egypt, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Jordan, in other countries. What happened to them? Well, they all went to Israel because they were kicked out of these countries. So if there's any ethnic cleansing, it was on the other side. The other side was ethnically cleansing. The Jews were not ethnically cleansing. And then there's this claim of apartheid. Well, apartheid. The Arabs are treated better in Israel than they're treated in the Arab countries. The women are allowed to drive a car. The gays are not tossed off of the top of buildings in Israel, and they are in these Arab countries. Then there's the fact that the Arabs have a political party in Israel, and they're even part of the Knesset. So this idea of ethnic cleansing and apartheid and all these charges are highly problematic.
Yeah, and you brought up a really interesting point, and I think it is one of the big, and I'm trying to learn, I'm trying to gather information and really trying to be nuanced in looking at this. Although I can clearly call out atrocities and evil when we see murder, I will always do that. But so backing up to the refugees question, I've always found it curious, and I've always thought I need to do more reading on this. I need to learn more about it. The refugees or the Palestinians, how come they were not taken into, as you alluded to, Jordan? If Gaza is currently in the world's biggest open-air prison, as I hear all the time from our libertarian friends and from many others on the left often, I'm willing to hear that. What's the evidence for that? But I say, okay, if it's the world's biggest open-air prison, then Egypt is a co-warden, right? Egypt is right there to the southwest. And I really have that honest question. Why are the Palestinian Arab people, these Muslims, why are they not welcome in places like Jordan or, of course, Egypt, famously? That to me is a very important question to have answered. Do you have more of a thought on that?
Yeah, let me give you an answer to that. The book that we wrote, me and Alan Fuderman, has a foreword by Bibi Netanyahu. And a quote from Bibi Netanyahu, this is a paraphrase, I don't remember his exact words, but it was something like, if Israel disarmed, there'd be no more Israel. We'd all be dead. If the Arabs disarmed, there'd be peace. Now look, Israel left, the Israeli government took all the Jews out of Gaza. They took them out, I think it was 2005 or 2007, and they could have had a Hong Kong of the Middle East.
Yes.
They were right near Israel, and Israel has a lot of high-tech stuff. And they were given all sorts of materials to build houses and pipes to build plumbing. Instead, what they did is they built tunnels under the border to try to get into Israel to engage in mass murder. So that's a big problem. Now, this open air prison, why is it an open air prison? Because they keep trying to send out rockets. They put their rocket launchers in the middle of a hospital, and or in the middle of a mosque, or in the middle of a school, and then they shoot rockets into Israel. And then they have these tunnels where they try to get in and murder and rape Israelis. And October 7th was not the first time they did this. Well, of course it's a prison, because they deserve to be prisoners, because they are violating the non-aggression principle of libertarianism. And as Bibi Netanyahu said, if they stop this, there'd be peace. There'd be no prisons, no open air prison or anything else of the sort. So that would be my response to that accusation.
Yes, and I do think about in the situation of Gaza, it was returned, I believe, to the Palestinian Muslim people in, I believe, 2006 or somewhere thereabouts, 2005, 2006. And again, just an honest, good faith question. I really wonder how come when the Palestinian Muslims there, the Arabs, when they were given back Gaza, there's still all this rhetoric about it being occupied. And I have that honest question. Well, was it occupied? Were these people aggressed against? Or was there just a problem with the 2 million or 2.3 million people in Gaza? Is there a problem? Is there something that's an impediment to them having a free society where their economy can flourish and where they can have a state where if they want a state, if they desire a functioning government, not just Hamas acting like some kind of social welfare program plus terrorist group combined, but if they wanted a functioning civil society with a state, this is an honest question. How come they couldn't have that? I guess some libertarians might say, well, essentially Israel is putting sanctions on them, or Israel has created conditions that would prevent the Palestinian self-rule. I don't know if I'm totally doing their argument justice. I'm not trying to undercut their argument. I'm trying to understand how come in 15, 16, 17 years, the Palestinian people could not create a civil society and perhaps a government that they would want to live under. Is it the
Well,
fault of Israel, in other
no,
words?
I think it's hatred for Jews. If they didn't have hatred for Jews, they would live as peaceful neighbors. Look at how Israel treats the Arab citizens of Israel. They treat them very well. Whenever they're queried as to whether they'd like to be part of Palestine, Palestinian government, they say, no, we want to stay in Israel. Because what Hamas and the PA stand for is hatred of Judaism. If these people were peaceable, and they didn't make tunnels, and they didn't have rockets, and they were just peaceable, there'd be no problem. So I think they could have been the Hong Kong of the Middle East if they were peaceable, but they're not peaceable. They're based on hatred and committing atrocities. And they have this view that, what is it, from the sea to the river? The whole thing should be Arab, and the Jews should be kicked out or killed. No, not kicked out, killed. Because Hamas not only wants to kill Jews that are in Israel, Hamas wants to kill Jews anywhere, in Brooklyn.
Sure.
Now, they might not want to kill Bernie Sanders. I'm not sure about that. Bernie
Mhm.
Sanders is Jewish, but they can have no better supporter than Bernie Sanders. So I'm not sure if Hamas would kill Bernie Sanders. That would be an interesting question to ask a Hamas person.
And we certainly hope not, but yeah, it might be a scary answer. Let me ask too, specifically talking about the Temple Mount itself. I cannot believe a piece of real estate, and I know it's sacred to, I believe, Muslims and Jews. So I'm going to talk respectfully about that property, but obviously, historically, the facts are it was the site of the Jewish temple. Just that's the fact. Before the Muslims were in Jerusalem or had a part in East Jerusalem. And again, honest question in terms of property rights, at what point did the Jews give up their property rights to that temple site, which certainly I believe for the second temple, was the second temple destroyed in AD 70, I believe. But even possibly, is that the similar site to the first temple? I mean, this goes back hundreds or thousands of years before the fall of Jerusalem, before the Muslims sacked Jerusalem in AD 636. So again, asking these questions of libertarians and liberty-minded folks who respect property rights, why don't we turn the clock back to 636? Who was living in Jerusalem in 635 AD, 634? Certainly some Christians, certainly a lot of Jews, and then a lot of other people, I believe. But I don't know if there's a question in there, but I do think about property rights to the Temple Mount itself, Walter. It seems very charged at this point, and I'm not even advocating doing away with any kind of Muslim holy sites there. I think that ship has sailed, but it is extremely volatile. That little piece of real estate, and I find
Yes,
it
I
incredible.
agree with you. But the answer is clear. The Jews date back 3,300 years. The Muslims date back 1,600 years. The Jews were homesteading land before there were any such thing as a Muslim, before the birth of Muhammad. So it seems like case closed if you go back that far. Now, if you just go back to 1903, then things look differently, and I think incorrectly. And to answer your question, did the Jews ever give up this land? No, the Romans kicked them out, but they didn't give it up voluntarily. So look, if you have a lovely hat, and I'm going to grab your hat and I steal it, you didn't give it up. I just grabbed it from you. And in justice, you should get it back. Well, the Jews should get it back because they were there first.
Can I ask you, we just have a few more minutes and I want to respect your time. Let me ask you on the current situation in Gaza, because I do have concerns. Certainly, personally, I want Hamas to be destroyed. I want them to pay for what they have done. Certainly to all the innocent Jewish civilians in southern Israel, but then also to our countrymen, the Americans. I believe 27, 28, maybe 30 Americans were killed, and several Americans taken hostage, as well as other innocent people from around the world. That's despicable. It cannot be abided on Hamas's part. But with the impending ground incursion into Gaza, and we're recording this on a Friday, we don't know exactly when this is going to begin. I think Biden has been kind of trying to block them, and whatever's going on with the Biden administration. But the IDF keeps talking about this ground incursion into Gaza, coupled with a lot of military air raids and bombings and whatnot. What is the proper libertarian response here to all of the innocent Palestinian civilians that are probably trapped? I'm thinking of all the young people, the children there, who are caught between, the IDF and then this terrorist group of Hamas. A lot of us have concern for those innocent folks, and I've heard the number that a million human beings there are under the age of 18. I think that number is ballpark correct, but I can't prove it one way or the other. Certainly, those minors are innocent, and we want to protect their lives as well. What are your thoughts there, Walter, in terms of the proper way forward? How to make Hamas pay and ensure that they cannot destroy the lives, liberty, and property of others going forward? How do we make Hamas pay while also protecting the lives of innocents in Gaza?
Well, let me answer this in two ways. One, is the U.S. hypocritical in terms of demanding that Hamas be treated proportionately, or that the IDF be gentle in view of all of the innocent people that will be killed, whether a ground incursion or even right now without a ground incursion with all the bombs, the Israeli bombs? Well, how did the U.S. treat Germany in World War II? What did they do to Dresden? They bombed the crap out of Dresden. What did they do to Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Now, I'm not saying that the Israelis should, God forbid, use an atom bomb, but looking at it from the point of view of the U.S., and the claim that somehow the IDF should be gentle because there are innocent people there, well, the U.S. didn't look upon that in that way at all. They obliterated Dresden, Germany. They did even worse, if anything, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki and Japan in general. So I don't think the U.S. has any standing to say, well, the IDF, you should be proportional, you should be more gentle. Yes, you have to root out Hamas, but you can't do this, you can't do that. The U.S. didn't follow anything like that. When they ended World War II, very, how shall I say it, very harshly.
But to be fair, if I may interject respectfully, I think a lot of our friends, colleagues, and whatnot would say, well, we don't approve of maybe what the U.S. government did in these cases either, because innocent Japanese people, innocent Germans who wanted nothing to do with the Nazi Party, one could assume or hope, innocent civilians there were killed as well, and that is morally objectionable also. Or our government does not represent me. Many of us object to some of our governments or many of our government's actions.
Well, you remember I said I'm going to answer the question in two parts.
Okay.
The first
Yep.
part was what I just did.
Okay.
The second part is what you're now asking, which I had intended to do anyway.
Sorry to jump the gun.
No. You're a very good interview. You're doing a great job, but I just did want to put it on the record that I had intended to answer it in two ways. One, is the U.S. hypocritical or not? And yes, the U.S. is hypocritical. Secondly, well, what about libertarianism? We are libertarians here. We should answer it in libertarian ways. And I'm going to answer this in two different ways. The first is proportionality. What would proportionality mean? What proportionality would mean would be that the IDF should go into Gaza and start shooting civilians, as many civilians as were shot by the Hamas, and start raping women, and start killing children right in front of parents and killing parents right in front of children. And they should do it for 1,400 people, give or take. And then they should bring out 200 prisoners, hostages. If there was proportionality, if there was an eye for an eye, well, then Hamas would, you called it atrocious. And you were quite right at the beginning of this program. It was atrocious, and yet that's what should occur if there was this tit for tat or eye for an eye. Second point, Biden and all of the other people who are now calling for proportionality, suppose that's exactly what IDF did. And they've already done too much. Suppose a week ago they stopped with the bombardment. They just stopped. What would then happen? What would occur? What would occur is that the Hamas and Hezbollah would say that we got a paper tiger here. We ripped the crap out of them. We killed 1,400 people in the most atrocious manner possible. Not just the deaths, but the way that they did it. And we took pictures of it, and we showed pictures, and we had dancing in the street. And now all Israel does is shove a few bombs down our throat, and then they stop because Biden told them to. Well, what would happen? What would happen is that in a week or two, after they got through celebrating, after they got through dancing in the street, after they got through giving candy to their children, and remember, these are the people that voted in Hamas in the first place. After they got through, they would do it again. And there'd be another 1,400 Israelis and maybe 2,800 Israelis because the IDF is a paper tiger. They don't react. Look, suppose Mexico did to the U.S. what Hamas did to Israel. What would the U.S. do to Mexico? There'd be no more Mexico. There'd be no more Mexico if this was not the first time, or if Canada did it, or so. From a pragmatic point of view, we can justify this on the basis of self-defense. Namely, that if Israel didn't do it, then this would occur again, and it would occur again and again until there was no Israel, and no other country in the world would put up with anything like this. Israel, instead of bombs, they throw leaflets at people. Saying, this is danger, don't go here. Now, look, these people, what they do is they put their rocket launchers right in the middle of an orphanage or right in the middle of a hospital. And then they say, oh, Israel bombed a hospital, or Israel bombed an orphanage. Israel is evil. This is preposterous. Now let me give you a much more technical libertarian answer. How tall are you?
About 6'1".
You're 6'1", I'm 5'6". You're a big guy. And what I'm going to do, I'm going to get right behind you, and you have a gun and I have a gun, and I'm going to hide behind you. You're a much bigger guy than I am, and I'm going to start shooting at some guy, Joe. Got it? I'm standing behind you. I'm a bad guy. I'm a very bad guy, and I hate Joe, and I'm afraid if I just aim to shoot Joe, he'd shoot me back. But no. I've got you as a shield. And I hide behind you, and under your arm, I start shooting at Joe. And now, Joe, I've got you as a hostage. And Joe wants to shoot me. He doesn't want to shoot you. You're totally innocent. But the only way he can get me is right through you. His bullet will go right through you and get me. On the other hand, you don't much like that. You don't much like being shot by Joe, and you've got a gun. Now, you can't turn around and shoot me. That would be just, because I'm the bad guy. But for some reason, I've got you hypnotized. Who knows? You can't turn, but you can shoot Joe. So who is justified to shoot, you or Joe? I say Joe is justified to shoot you. You're not justified to shoot him, even in self-defense, because, now you have to wait for this, I also concocted this new theory called negative homesteading. We all know what positive homesteading is. You mix your labor with the land, you domesticate a cow.
Lockean. Yeah.
John Locke. But suppose lightning hits me, and I have a bracelet which will deflect the lightning onto you. You're an innocent person. Do I have a right to do that? No. Because I was the first homesteader of the misery, namely the lightning hit me. I am not justified in pointing it off on you. Well, who was the first person to homestead misery, you or Joe? You. First I grab you, then I start shooting at Joe. So now let's get back to the Hamas. What Hamas has got is only 200 or so hostages? No. Hamas has got 2 million hostages.
All of Gaza, essentially.
All of Gaza is their hostage. And what they're saying to Israel is, well, you can't shoot us because you'll hit hostages. And I say, no, they're the first homesteaders of the misery. They voted for Hamas, and now Hamas has got them. Too bad. Now, this sounds cruel. But the point is that the shield is not got the right. The shield, you're the shield, or the Hamasians, or rather the Gazans. You get it? So, and I've written 2 or 3 articles on the shield and the missile and all sorts of stuff like that. But I think the proper libertarian analysis is when the bad guy has a shield, the good guy is able to shoot the bad guy even though the shield dies. Now, it sounds very bad because there are innocent 6-year-old Palestinians. And they're toddlers. They're 4 years old. What did they do wrong? And yet, they are the shield. And Hamas has captured them. So if any death occurs, it's Hamas's fault, even though Israel shot them. So I now have 3 arguments that I regard as libertarian arguments. One, what would happen if Israel followed this be nice policy? Well, then there'd be no more Israel. Secondly, self-defense. Third, the shield. You have no right. The shield, life is forfeit. Now, it sounds cruel, and I don't know how else to deal with it, but it's Israeli children versus Palestinian children. And who started this? Who is the initiator of violence? It's not the Israeli children. It's the Hamas who is using the Palestinian children as a shield. So that would be my answer to your very well thought out objection.
Yeah, I guess, Walter, where I would come from, and idealistically, perhaps, I don't mean to be a utopian, but I would hope that special forces could go in incursions and just take it to the top 200, leaders in Hamas, take them out, like their equivalent of the SEALs, the Delta Force. Surgically, they take them out, they inflict damage, and then we take out, Israel takes out the financial structure of Hamas. In a perfect world, that's what I would hope for, because I do think Hamas has to pay for their crimes against the Israeli civilians. Absolutely. But then I look at what's happening. It's terrible. The targeting of hospitals, largely by Hamas. That's largely on them. If you're hiding amongst children, schools, hospitals, that's despicable morally. And it obviously puts, it's done on purpose. Of course that's done. I just would hope in my idealistic way that we could go in, or, Israel could go in with their special forces, take out Hamas terrorists, and then surgically de-extract themselves. That's what I would hope for.
Who could disagree with that?
Sure.
That'd be great. But IDF, I think it's the best army in the world, certainly man for man. But I don't think they're capable of just shooting terrorists and not shooting any innocent people. this is just unrealistic. It would be nice. It would be nice if you could turn around and shoot me. Remember, I'm the bad guy. I'm Hamas.
In that scenario, yeah, right.
But I stipulate you can't turn around and shoot me. I stipulate the IDF can't do that. They're not that good. They're very, very good, but they can't kill the terrorists and not kill innocent people.
Can I ask you one more topic before we wrap up? Related to this, of course, but a lot of really well-meaning liberty types, who I agree with, who you agree with, I would venture to say 90% or more of the time, have again kind of allied themselves with this cause of the Palestinians. And I totally understand Palestinian individuals. You want to look out for their children. You want to protect the lives, liberty, and property of innocents. Given. Let's put that aside as a given. But yet it seems that there's some kind of affinity. There's some kind of, dare I say, affection, for this Free Palestine cause, which lines up right next to memes and flags and banners for, in many cases, BLM, Black Lives Matter, and other cultural Marxist kinds of causes, like a lot of like trans flags, a lot of go in and let's go for Ukraine. And Ukraine, I'd love to hear your thoughts on that on a different day. But all of these current the big current topics that the left has embraced, it's amazing that this Free Palestine, the Palestinian issue, has taken such a prominent place there. There are injustices around the world, and I'm always amazed that this Palestinian issue is front and center. Why do you think that is, and why does it align directly on the left axis, on that axis of leftist causes around the world? This is always prominent, top 2 or 3, I would say. Do you have any thoughts on that, and why so many libertarians have gone in full bore with not even a nuanced approach in some cases?
Well, that's a good question, a very tough question. I don't know why so many libertarians follow. Well, one reason for it is Murray Rothbard. Murray Rothbard is properly revered as the eminent theoretician of liberty. And I agree, he is. He is Mr. Libertarian. Sure. But I think on this one issue, he's wrong. However, many libertarians follow Murray Rothbard, which is eminently reasonable. In any other issue, not any other issue, I disagree with him also on, pro-choice versus pro-life abortion. Murray is pro-choice, Ron Paul is pro-life. I think they're both wrong. I think evictionism is correct. But on one answer to your question is, why are so many libertarians pro-Palestinian? Murray Rothbard. Okay. Rothbard was pro-Palestinian. Murray Rothbard is the leader, the intellectual leader of the movement, and therefore they follow him. So that would be one answer. Sure. Another answer would be Jews in the U.S. vote for the Democratic Party. I think something like 92%. And maybe 8%, no, 7% for the Republicans and 1% for Libertarians. We always get 1%.
Sure.
And I think that maybe now this is changing, because a lot of Jews who are left liberal Jews who vote for the Democratic Party just based on, knee-jerk reactions are now going to be thinking twice. Because, yes, AOC and Bernie Sanders are very pro-Palestinian, but even the mainstream Democrat like Biden is now urging peace. Well, we see what would happen if peace broke out right now. They would do it again. So even Biden, who is more mainstream than Bernie Sanders, I don't think anyone could disagree with that. The Jews, the left liberal Jews, I think are now going to start scratching their head and say, hey, whoa, maybe we've been backing the wrong horse. Not that we're going libertarian, because libertarians are also Palestinian, but maybe we'll go Republican. And the Jews are only 2% of the electorate, but the Jews have more of a megaphone than other people have. They're wealthier, better organized, whatever. So I think this would have implications for the election if they count ballots as opposed to having an election with no ballots the way they did the last election, I think. I think that there will be a move in the direction on the part of the Jewish left liberals to no longer vote for the Democratic Party anything like 95 or 92%. It might be more 50-50. It might be 40-60. Maybe the Jews will give 60% of their vote for the Republicans. So that would be another implication. Look, I got to get off, but I really enjoyed this, and let's invite me again, and we'll talk about Ukraine, and we'll talk about abortion, and we'll talk about many other issues that we couldn't get to this time.
Really appreciate your time. Walter Block, everybody. Thank you very much for coming on the podcast, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Take care.
Thanks very much, Walter.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
This has been the California Liberty Project podcast. Make sure to subscribe, share it with others, and follow us on Instagram and Twitter.